Hey, everybody, welcome back to the next episode of How to Get Away with Staffing. My name is Colin LeBeau, president here at Foxhire, employer of record service here in the US, and I've got our director of HR, Jessica Arbie, with us today again to talk all things compliance. Hey, Jess.
Hey Colin, how you doing?
Doing good. Welcome back. I think you're our most seasoned guest here on the podcast with all of the HR related compliance stuff. So appreciate you being back.
No problem. Happy to be here.
Good. Well, we're going to talk about one of the most favorite places people like to do staffing, but maybe one of the most difficult, the Empire State, New York. There's a lot to know when looking to hire in New York, and we've had increasing regulations in that state over the last 2 or 3 years specifically. So thought we might walk through New York and see what you got to know about it when you look to staff there.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe we just start with the first step. If you want to post a job, you're looking for candidates in New York, is there anything you need to be worried about or consider when you go ahead and do that?
Right. Yep. So New York is one of those states. There are several states that have pay transparency laws.
Mhm.
New York, again, like is one of them. They part of that law requires that whenever you post a job, that you include a salary range with the posting. So if you are putting a new role out there, make sure you always have that salary range. And it actually, some of the laws in the different states with pay transparency laws say even if you're posting for a remote job from anywhere, you're looking nationally for an employee, that these rules do apply. So
Right.
not only New York, there are other states, but yeah, definitely if you're located in New York and you're looking for a New York candidate specifically, it's really important to have that in there.
Make sure you're following the pay transparency laws. That's relatively new. So definitely be aware of that. Really just any staffing, agency, you guys post a lot of jobs. So
Mhm.
making sure that the pay transparency law compliance stuff is taken into account when you do post those roles is super important. Let's say you got a candidate from one of those job postings. You got to screen them to make sure that they can actually work. Anything related to like pre-employment screening, background checks, etc.
Yep. Yeah, so a couple things. So with the background check, it's really important to make sure that you're working with a reputable screening provider, someone that is very well versed in multi-state employment or specifically New York. The state of New York has a newer law that came out in 2024, the Clean Slate Law. Well, they made some changes to it in 2024,
Hmm.
that really kind of lock down some of the rules around cleaning the slate for people who, have had a conviction in the past and, they can get those things removed from their background. Also, it's you're not allowed to look beyond 7 years on anyone in the state of New York. So if you say for instance, if you're working with a provider that is not well versed in New York law, for example, what if they give you records that are older than 7 years? You want to make sure that you know those rules so that you're not making any adverse decisions based on historical information that's probably not in the purview of what the law is in New York. So
For
that's
sure.
important. Also with drug screening, that's another kind of hot button topic with marijuana. I mean,
Yeah.
it's obviously we know it's not legal federally, but there are, I think, 38 states with medical marijuana allowed and 24 states that have legal recreational marijuana. So in the state of New York,
Yeah.
it's fully legal. It's one of those things that most employers are just trying to steer away from,
Don't
just
even worry about it.
well, yeah, just
Don't even
basically
test for it.
take it off the
Don't even
list.
think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, because when you do test for it, then are showing that you have knowledge. If they failed, say the marijuana on that test, um, are you then later showing discrimination in employment, even if you didn't say, hold back from hiring them, but you have awareness of, and it really should not ever affect any decision making
Right.
with applicants or employees throughout the life of their employment on any, recreational, legal, off-duty use of marijuana. So,
Right.
again, most employers have just removed it from their lineup on their drug screenings. There are some like scenarios where, if it's like a safety sensitive role that qualifies under the New York law, you would still be okay to, make decisions on that. Or if you're an agency that's doing like federal contracts, for example, you would still follow the federal law. So you would be able to make decisions if you're doing federal contracts based on,
Nuances there to be worried about.
yeah, there's a lot of red tape. And then also, ways around the red tape depending on what situation you're in. So yeah, a lot to know there.
Yeah. And when you mentioned earlier about having a reputable provider do
Mhm.
screening, so what might you look for if you're looking for a screenings provider and you know you're going to be working in New York? What are some of the things you might ask about or look for to make sure that that's a good provider? Anything you could think of?
Yeah, so when you're looking for a provider, you want someone that, is following the FCRA rules, the Fair Credit Reporting Act rules. They would be, someone who is considered to be a like a certified provider for those types of services.
Okay.
Do they have their own in-house like legal that is, directing what they're doing? And also, if you're a multi-state employer, it's a really important question to ask, like, are you a multi-state compliant
Provider.
screening provider? Yeah.
Right.
Or, if you're just in one state or a couple of states, just make sure that they have a really good handle on what those states are that you're going to be working in. Um, yeah. So, and then also, depending on what kind of clients you work with, there might be very different types of screening needs for those clients. So you want to make sure that you know what those needs are ahead of time before you're going out and picking your provider, because, especially if you're looking at several different ones, some of them don't provide all of those screening
Yeah,
services
you
that
got
you
to get
need.
multiple people lined
Right.
up to do different stuff.
Right. So it's easiest if you can just pick one that can cover everything that you need, um, ideally.
Yeah. And you mentioned 7 years as being the limit of how long you can look back. What I believe the standard background check that people consider is like just normal is 7 years, right? Or are there differences there? Do some people do 10 years? Like, is there any concern that you might have to like tell your provider beforehand, it's only 7 years, or is that like the standard?
Yep. It's based on like you can tell them what your needs are. Like if you only ever want to do 7 years, then you tell them that's how you want your packages set up. We're
Okay.
only ever wanting to look at 7 years or less. If you don't tell them that, then they will base it off of whatever the state law is. So,
Got it.
they might show you in, like using Ohio as an example, they might show you all history back 30 some years, in some cases,
Yeah.
and you might not want that information, but now you have it in front of your face. So, ideally most employers will pick like, here's what we want in our packages and
Got
don't show me anything beyond that. Um, yeah, because it's important to know like what's required in the different states and are you going beyond that?
Yeah. Yeah. So having that vendor that is familiar with New York helps you avoid some of those mistakes there because they'll know what the law is and all that type of stuff. So yeah,
Right.
that's important. Let's say they got the job though. Let's say that person got past the screening, got the job. What about onboarding? Are there any specific onboarding requirements that New York imposes on employers?
Yep. Yeah, so onboarding and also like employment things. So one of the onboarding things that's important is sexual harassment training. It's mandated by the state of New York. There's a manager versus employee specific training. So if you're a manager in New York, you have to take one type of training. It's a little bit longer of a course, I believe. And then if you're just a regular employee, then you have to take a different type of training. Yeah, so typically it's like annual training that has to be provided to those employees by the employer.
Got
And
it.
then other things like employment related. So like when you're setting up your payroll systems and things like that, you want to make sure that you're setting up mandated sick time. So the state of New York requires that you have sick time banks for employees so that they can use it when they need sick time off, at a rate of 1 hour for every hour that they've worked, or every 30 hours that they've worked. So in their bank, they'll start accruing 1 hour of sick time available to use at a later date for every 30 hours that they work.
And that can be tough because staffing clients don't always want to pay for sick time. So,
Mhm.
that's a cost you have to consider as you do staffing in New York. It's not like you're going to be able to bill for that time. So, factoring that into your price point could be something to consider as well. If you have people that are going to be working for 90 days, 120 days, they'll build up a decent amount of sick time.
Mhm. Yeah, true. And in scenarios where you have, um, if you're treating it as if it's PTO, so like some clients may want to add PTO on top of sick time. If you have only one bucket of leave, that's, accruing for sick time, but also has PTO in it. You have to treat it as PTO and actual earned wages. So, like to be able to follow that sick time rule of not having to pay it out at the end of employment as if it's wages, you have to have two separate buckets where you can show, here's how much sick time you have, here's how much PTO you have. If you're not doing it that way, then you should always treat it as if it's PTO time that's been accrued and pay it out at the end of the assignment.
Yeah, so that's a fixed cost. If you're not separating the buckets, it's a fixed cost. You're going to pay it out regardless.
Right.
Variable cost if you are doing the two separate buckets. So tracking that would be valuable to you if you wanted to avoid a fixed cost on the sick time at least.
Yeah. Yep. And then another thing setting up for your payroll has to do with disability for the employee. It's a state mandate, and then also paid family leave for the employee. So those two benefits are required by the state. It's something that's handled through your payroll deductions from their pay, and the employer has to pay it into the state fund based on whatever that rate requirement is. And then whenever the employee, has an issue, say they got injured or have an illness that happened outside of work that takes them out of work, or if they have a family health issue, they're trying to take care of a family member, or they, are going to have a child. Those are all circumstances where they could use that disability and file for that through the state and take time off of work, get paid through the state, and it's protected job protection while they're out, but also an opportunity to be paid at least a small amount, something that is covering them while they're out on that leave. But that's something the employer has to like make sure they have it set up and, are prepared to help fill out paperwork and things like that whenever the employee does go and take one of those kinds of leave.
And when you say job protection, that means you should be able to give them their job back when they come back from that leave. But that can be difficult in the staffing environment because you don't always have steady employment opportunities if a client were to say, hey, we're going to move on, or they only had one opening. So sticking close with that person and making sure that you can line something up that's new for them when they do come back off that leave can solve a lot of challenges for you because you don't want them to come back off of leave and not have a place to go.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely challenging in staffing when, it's limited time on a role, it's temporary job. So it's just a
Yep.
constantly revolving challenge. Another thing that employers need to be aware of is making sure that you provide paid jury duty when an employee goes out on jury duty in New York. So if you're employing 10 people or more in the state of New York, you need to give the employee a stipend of $40 per day for the first 3 days. So it's only 3 days, but just make sure you have something set up in your payroll system to make sure that you're able to make that happen, basically, because it's not like a normal hourly rate or, anything like that. You can obviously, require that the employee turn in their summons for jury duty so that you can, use that as documentation to support it. But yeah, so sometimes employers aren't aware that is even a requirement, especially if you're not like located in New York and you're used to the New York rules. It's, one of those things that you might be surprised by at some point.
Yeah. And clients don't want to pay for that either. They don't want to pay for jury duty at all. So another cost to consider factoring in. It's more rare than the sick time situation, but
Mhm.
if you do face that situation, it could be quite a bit of time spent on jury duty that you have to figure out. Yep. Okay, so a lot of like setup stuff.
Mhm.
Before you even get this person working, a lot of things to consider, as far as the payroll system and all of that type of stuff, getting them set up properly. But maybe even before that, you've got to be set up as an organization to be successful. So what about any licenses or certifications that you need to carry as an entity to even start staffing in New York?
Right. Yeah. So New York has an employment agency license requirement. So any company that is an entity that charges a fee for the placement of a candidate in employment with a third party employer is required to be licensed by the state of New York with that employment agency license. So
Yep.
make sure you're aware of that.
And then I think
Also,
there is a healthcare license also. If you're doing healthcare in New York, you need to carry a license to do that as well, which is separate from the employment agency license.
yep, that's right. Yeah, there is a requirement for healthcare staffing licenses in New York. I think it's fairly new-ish
It
since
is, yeah.
COVID.
Most of the healthcare staffing licenses are new across the country. New York is one of the newer ones in that group as well. There are definitely a lot of challenging requirements within that license to comply with from a pricing perspective. I'll just call that out specifically. That can be a whole other conversation because their license is specifically difficult amongst all the other licenses. But most of the license requirements across the country were driven by what we saw with COVID-19 and the surge in contract labor spend. A lot of the CFOs and hospital system leaders are responding to that by working with government entities to demand certain levels of performance and price transparency and certifications for their healthcare staffing vendors in their states. So New York was very aggressive in that regard. They actually had to roll back some of their requirements already because they were too stringent, but what remains is still difficult. So definitely would say look that up if you don't know about it and you're doing healthcare staffing in New York. It is a newer license, so the enforcement of that license hasn't been super strong yet, but over the next 12, 24 months, we expect that to be much more aggressive as far as enforcement is concerned. So a couple licenses to carry if you're doing healthcare staffing, just one if you're doing regular staffing in New York. Some of those license requirements also impact how people get paid. And the state talks a lot about how people get paid. That, in our world, they call that wage and hour requirements. Any of those that we should be considering, Jess, when we talk about staffing in New York?
Yeah, so in 2023, the state of New York actually made wage theft, which is, not paying wages, basically
Yeah.
failure to pay wages. They consider it larceny now, which is
Well,
something that can be criminally punished. So
right.
it's something that you want to make sure. I mean, obviously, we want to pay people correctly. We want to make sure that that's always handled properly. But there are so many differences state to state. You want to make sure that just stay as up to date as possible on those different types of things. But like for New York, one thing on, the radar a lot of times is like, are there differences with overtime or double time, things like that, minimum wages. For New York, it actually, surprise, surprise, is the same as FLSA. So it's the same
Got
as
it.
the federal rule for overtime. So there's no extra like
Nice.
double time or like a daily overtime, nothing like that. So
Yeah.
it's basically just 1.5 times um, the normal regular pay for any hours worked over 40 in the work week. And again, no double time or, daily overtime or anything like that in New York.
Interesting. Okay. That makes things a little bit easier, at least in that regard. It's
One
normal.
easy thing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's good. That's good. How
Uh,
about New York City? Like, is New York City different at all than the rest of the state? I mean, when people think New York that don't live there, they think about New York City, but there's upstate New York and then, there's New York City. So any differences there?
Yep. Yeah. So with so for example, minimum wage is, New York has a much higher minimum
Yeah,
wage than federal and a lot of other states. So minimum wage in New York and statewide is $15 an hour. That's actually going up to 15.50 January 1st, 2025. Um,
got it.
New York City and the like counties around New York City
Yeah. The
actually are
five
50,
boroughs, they call it.
yeah, they're
Yeah.
actually 50 cents higher all the
Yeah.
time, usually 50 cents higher on minimum wage. And then also with exempt status. So that's another really big one, I think, to point out is if you have um, employees that are going to be overtime exempt. So, if they pass the test for
Salary workers.
exempt status, yeah, salary employees that are, able to work under exempt status. So you don't have to pay them overtime, but there are minimum salary requirements and minimum salary frequency requirements that go along with that under the FLSA, which that FLSA, the federal minimum is like $684 per week, or the equivalent of like 35,000, just a little over 35,000 annually. For the state of New York, it's actually almost double that. It's like 58,000 currently for the annual salary, and for New York City and those counties like Nassau, Suffolk, and Westchester County, it's
Yep.
higher at 62,400 annually, and that's current. It's actually going up a little bit again January 1st, 2025, because minimum wage goes up. So every time minimum wage goes up,
They jack
that's
up
going
those
to get
exempt
paid.
requirements. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Definitely important. People think they can just, oh, they're a salary worker. Well, okay, but they have to make a certain amount. So definitely important to consider. And let's say they make it all the way through that process. They get hired, they get screened, they get paid. Then the end of their assignment comes, and staffing, it always does, right? So any termination requirements, anything we have to be considering when we are terminating somebody in New York so that we protect our business, we don't do anything wrong.
Yep. Yep. So New York requires at the separation of employment that the employer actually gives the employee a notice of their termination. So there has to be something in writing that you give to the employee within 5 days of the termination. So it must be within 5 days. It needs to tell them the date of their termination on the document. It needs to let them know any benefits that have been terminated in coordination with this end of employment. And also it has to provide them information about their rights to file for unemployment. So you can either include whatever details are required on your, in-house document, or there's actually a specific form on the New York Department of Labor website that, has all those details on it that you could just use that form too as your form. But yep, you want to make sure you do that within 5 days of the end.
Okay, got it. So you can't just say, don't come back tomorrow. You got to actually say something a little bit more formal with all that information. So interesting. Okay. Well, there's a lot to consider in New York. Staffing in that state can be difficult. The taxes in that state are a little bit higher. There are extra requirements. There are risks that are imposed upon your organization as a staffing firm if you do work there that maybe are different than other states. So definitely consider all these costs and risks as you enter New York and consider doing business there. You could always partner with an employer of record like ourselves to help make that a little bit smoother, de-risk that opportunity. But in general, you want to be aware of these things because ultimately they impact your ability to sell. They impact how things work in that state. So we hope that going over it for you guys was valuable to you. Would love to have you guys watch the next podcast. Please subscribe on YouTube. Otherwise, we'll see you next time on How to Get Away with Staffing. Thanks so much. Bye, Jess.